Hey, Redeemer family, and welcome back to another Pastoral Quick Takes. Why are we following our governing authorities' requirements for our in-person gatherings? Why did we wait to start gathering until we were given the clear to meet in groups of 50 or less? Why are we sticking with 50 or less? Why are our fellowship groups only being encouraged to meet together in person if you can be outside and in a group of 25 or less? I want to share as quickly as I can some observations, very briefly, from two New Testament passages that have informed the elders' decisions to commit to follow all of the requirements that our state and county officials have placed on us to the best of our ability. We have received some questions and even helpful criticisms regarding why we would choose to do this, and have sensed even maybe an amount of angst in a segment of our body that's trying to, as we all are, wade through this fog of COVID-19 that has descended on us as it relates to how we should live as the church in this time. So two passages. First of all, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. The context of this passage is the Apostle Paul writing to these Roman Christians, and he, in fact, if you have an ESV, the heading that precedes this passage, the heading of which is submission to authorities, the heading that comes just before it in chapter 12 is marks of the true Christian, which I think is a helpful way of considering what Paul is talking about. And throughout all of Romans, Paul is speaking of the outworking of a life that is transformed by the grace of God in the gospel. And so here he comes to some practical outworkings of how we should then live. And this is what he says in verses 1 through 7 of Romans 13. Listen or follow along in your own Bible as I read. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Just a few very brief observations. First of all, we are commanded in this passage to be subject to our human authorities. It's a command. This is imperative language. Let every person be subject or submit to their governing authorities. Secondly, we see that authority that these earthly governors have comes from God. And so a resistance to that earthly government is actually a resistance toward God. And resisting God does not go well for the one who is resisting. Thirdly, we see that these governing authorities are servants of God, even if they don't know it, and certainly many of them do not even care about God. But because they are servants of God, it is a privilege and joy to do good under them and receive their subsequent favor. And lastly, obedience to these earthly governments is also good for your conscience. Have you noticed that before? In this passage here, where the Apostle Paul says in verse 5, not only to avoid God's wrath, but for the sake of conscience. So conversely, disobeying and resisting earthly authorities will harm your conscience, and it may instill a sinfully rebellious disposition that is deceitful and damaging to the way that you think about what is right and what is wrong. Second passage I want to point you to is in 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17. The context of this passage is the Apostle Peter, this time writing to a bunch of Christians that are dispersed and spread out which we in our church have referred to recently as saved, suffering servants. And he's speaking of what it is to live life as a sojourner in a land to which they don't fully belong. And he says this in verses 13 through 17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. A few observations in this text as well. Our submission, according to this passage, to our Colorado State's houses of worship guidelines is for the Lord's sake. The Apostle Peter says to be subject, same word here, submit to these earthly institutions for the Lord's sake. It brings him glory. To do so, Peter says in verse 13 still, or excuse me, in verse 15, is to do the will of God. Second observation, our obedience to our governing authorities will often silence ignorant, foolish accusations against us that may say, if we're disobeying, that we don't care, in our case, for the safety of others, or that we're hypocrites for touting righteousness as Christians but disobeying our governing authorities. Third observation in this text that I see is that our freedom is to be used in service to God. Live as people who are free, not using freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. In other words, it's possible for us to live as free people in a way that is actually evil and not as a servant of God. And Peter calls us to use our freedom in service to God, which certainly includes serving and loving others and obeying the authorities that God has put over us. And so perhaps this freedom would include for us this service of wearing a mask, if you can, of social distancing out of respect for others and for the leaders who have asked us to do so based on CDC guidelines. And the final observation from this text is that the emperor that Peter called them to honor and submit to was objectively, literally, oppressive and evil and wanting to suppress the truth. Our Governor Jared Polis, our President Donald Trump, the CDC, Adams County leadership, they're not even close. I don't know of any reason to think that any of those people are Christians, but we are not being suppressed. We are not being oppressed. We are not being persecuted. That day may come, but it's not here now. And yet, Peter calls these Christians to honor the emperor who was probably persecuting them. Now, this isn't a sermon on these passages. I'm going to wrap up now. It's just a quick take, but there are obviously plenty of things here for us to chew on. So I would encourage you, brother, sister in Christ, Redeemer family, to go into it yourself. Grab a good commentary, grab your study Bible if you have one, and dig into these passages and the words of the apostles based on what the Lord is revealing to us as we navigate this uncomfortable and difficult path. You know, we American Christians often can easily get twisted up and confused when it comes to obeying authority because the DNA of our culture, of our national heritage, is one of rebellion and resistance. And in many ways, we're thankful for that, but we must be careful because it can be very dangerous and lead us to sin in not receiving God's authority and then receiving God's discipline or judgment. Brothers and sisters, listen, let me be very, very clear. If the government, if our state or if our county had told us to stop worshiping God, to cease prayer, to discontinue the proclamation of Christ crucified and risen for us, we would have disobeyed. Make no mistake. We ought to obey God rather than man. But thankfully, they have actually encouraged us to continue our religious services along with other religions, such as Mormons and Muslims and Orthodox Jews, all these other houses of worship, along with us, have been encouraged to continue virtually and or in keeping with the requirements that they have laid on us for social distancing as recommended by the CDC. And listen, if the government calls on us eventually to stop teaching parts of the Bible that are deemed insensitive or outdated, we will disobey. We will preach the word. We will gather for worship, even if that means we have to hide in house churches because the government has decided that gathering for Christian worship and for public preaching and teaching of the Bible are illegal. God has used such efforts in nations such as China to grow a massive spread of the kingdom, and we would be honored and delighted to join in with that if that day would come. But right now, our government is making an imperfect yet deliberate effort at doing good for its citizens while maintaining respect for our religious freedoms, and we're thankful for that. There are things that we're frustrated by. There are things that we wish were different, and we have even voiced some of those things to our local and state leaders. But we are happy to submit to what they've asked us to do because the scriptures command us to. And so, Redeemer family, remember, we are subject to our governing authorities. They have been given authority by God, and to obey and to submit to them is to obey and to submit to God. That's why we are following our governing authorities' requirements for our in-person gatherings, and we will continue to do so as long as they're there and as long as they are not asking us to disobey the Scripture's command to worship and to teach and to fellowship and to proclaim Christ living for us, crucified for us, and risen for us. May His grace and peace rest on you this weekend.